social and effective neuroscience, doing research on morality, pro-social behavior, social decision-making, and how all that is manifested in the brain. Dr. FeldmanHall, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So how did you first get interested in neuroscience or psychology, whichever one came first?
Okay, so we're going way back. I was college and I was a double major in English literature and history. And you have to take different courses where I went to university. So you have to take like laboratory courses, language courses, and so on and so forth. And so I needed to fulfill my lab course, which I was not very excited about. And I thought, okay, instead of taking, chemistry or bio, I'll take neuroscience. And that first class I absolutely loved, and I felt hard for neuroscience. It was really exciting for me. And so I started taking other classes, and I realized pretty quickly that I was very passionate about the topic. And so I ended up switching one of my majors, history, to neuroscience or biopsychology, as it's called. And in college, I also ended up doing some bench work later on, more towards, I think in between my junior and senior year, although I can't quite remember. And when I did that bench research, I was like, I'm never going to be a neuroscientist. This is so isolating and so hard, and the work that I'm doing feels so incremental. I was working in an ALS lab at Harvard, working on a mouse model. And so I decided not to pursue neuroscience after I graduated. But after going out into the real world, I realized that I didn't really like that either. So I had some other jobs. I worked in politics on Capitol Hill in the Senate, and I wanted to come back into academia. So I thought, okay, I'll apply for my PhD. I wasn't actually sure whether I wanted to do a PhD or go to medical school. And I said, okay, I'm going to apply to both and see what I get into. And I ended up applying for PhD programs first because of the timeline, and I got in. And so that's basically what dictated my career. It was very luck oriented and not nearly as thoughtful as some of my students are now as I think about going to grad school.
Did your background in English literature influence your decision to study morality and pro-social behavior and stuff like that?
I don't know. I mean, maybe, because it definitely shaped, what I was thinking about and what I was reading at the time, and what I had been doing before and what I have been doing since. So it basically shaped, who I am as a person in some ways. But I think, more precisely, when I was applying for my PhD programs, when you apply to Cambridge or Oxford, I got my PhD at Cambridge, you actually have to write a proposal about what you want to study. And I sat down to write that. And so what I did is I went to PubMed and I spent the weekend basically, reading papers, lots and lots of papers. And the papers that were really interesting to me became a smaller and smaller paper. It was things about, morality. And so what I wrote my proposal on is, in some ways, more or less what I'm still studying today.
Mm-hmm. And what was the proposal, or what did you actually end up doing in grad school?
The proposal was to study a model of morality that mirrored the tensions that we see in the real world, and to map what was happening in the brain when we made those types of decisions. And I wanted to, I guess the one thing I didn't do in grad school that I had put in my proposal is I also wanted to work on lesion populations to see if you ablate part of the brain, what would be the contributions to a moral choice. For example, let's say you have a lesion in the OFC or the amygdala. What would that mean for moral decision making? Which I did not do in grad school because that's really hard research to do.
Mm-hmm. So is moral decision making like its own domain, or is it really just a form of complex decision making, and it's like you're taking into account, how is this going to affect me socially?
I think that question could be answered by in different ways, depending on who you asked it to. I think moral decision making is a field now because of how many people study moral decision making. I think that it's perhaps a subfield of social cognition. So I would argue now that I study social cognition more broadly. It's not just narrowly focused on morality, but in my PhD at that time, it was very focused on the moral dynamics that we engage with in our, I guess, everyday lives. We're trying to do something to that end.
Mm-hmm. And how did that after your PhD, what type of work did you start doing? How did that transition?
Let's see. So I went to work with Liz Phelps for my postdoc, and I also had second mentorship by Paul Glimsher. And neither one of them studies social decision making, and certainly not morality in the strictest term. They're not social psychologists. Liz did or is interested in neuroeconomics and social decision making broadly. But I was surrounded by people who did nothing even remotely like what I was interested in. So, like fear conditioning, and there was some monkey physiology work and so forth in Paul's lab. So I got exposed to a whole host of different methods and ideas and hypotheses, and they pretty much broadened the types of questions that I was interested in and how I looked at the questions that I had been interested in. And so it was that sort of melting pot of many different people doing different things that I think started to shape the direction of what I was looking at and what I was interested in.
Mm-hmm. What are some examples of those types of questions?
That I got interested in my postdoc?
Yeah.
So we used to sit in this postdoc pen at NYU, and there was a whole bunch of us, and things would like come to mind, and somebody would lean over and say something, or we would be in lab meeting and somebody might be presenting on fear conditioning or memory study, and somebody else who was interested in neuroeconomics might say, well, have you ever thought about it in X domain or something else? So there was a lot of ideas floating around from different places. And I think one example of synergy between me and one of my colleagues, Joey Dunsmore, who studies fear conditioning, is we started talking about this idea of generalization, stimulus generalization, and how that might happen in the social domain. And he had studied this in humans, but has very deep knowledge about a whole host of different species of how stimulus generalization works. And so we thought about ways of testing it in the social domain. It came up ultimately in the domain of trust, and changing what the perceived trustworthiness of the people that you would encounter in, let's say, an economic trust game. And it was really, that work was really informed by how, he was thinking about stimulus generalization in a much more basic domain, as early on as pigeons pecking at different colors of blue to get food, and how that would generalize across the color spectrum to get that reward.
It seems like there's a huge amount of overlap between social decision-making work and neuroeconomics. Does that have something to do with the way you have to design the studies?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I guess, the way that I see it is that social decision-making borrows, or social cognition borrows from lots of different fields. And I think there's a lot of power in, game theory models, because those models try to reflect the tensions that happen between interacting people. And so I think that can be very powerful, because not only does it try to bring the tension from the outside world into the lab, but there's also a level of precision in modeling those types of choices. So you give certain boundary conditions to whatever the test bed might be, and then you place a monetary measurement on what people are willing to do to, let's say, reject an unfair offer. So how much is it worth it to somebody to reject, and how much money are they willing to give up? And that helps to take a lot of the stuff that we study in the social world into a more precise domain by giving it some sort of metric that we can all understand, in this case, money.
It seems like game theory tries to model humans as like these rational agents that do their best to maximize reward and avoid punishment. But then we're irrational at times, especially when it comes to emotion. And I know you've done some research looking at how emotion influences decision making, right?
Yeah, so I'm not a fan of using the words rational and irrational in any to describe any choices, in part because I think that they mislead people to think that there's something important in quote unquote rationality or quote unquote irrationality. And especially when it comes to emotions, if you're an economist, you might say that, you know, emotions lead people to do quote unquote irrational things, but my argument would be that emotions are incredibly powerful signals to orient you to behave in adaptive and actually optimal ways. Even if they seem irrational because you're giving up money, that's not necessarily playing the long game of building a reputation or investing in a long-term relationship, which might come at a cost initially, but bear out fruits later on.
How do you study that? And when you're doing neuroimaging research, is it like people are inside the brain scanner and then you're just asking them what they're feeling? Or is it like you're looking at specific activations and inferring the emotion?
You could do both. You know, we actually have some work coming out from our lab, led by one of my graduate students, Joey Dunsmore, where, you know, he's taken this incredibly novel approach, or I think it's novel approach to quantifying emotion. And there's you know, actually a number of studies now in which he does this. But do you want me to get into the science yet?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, where he basically tries to map what we call an emotion prediction error during an economic game. So the way that he does this is he gives people this affective grid. It's, you know, a simple circumplex where there's two dimensions. There's an arousal dimension and there's a valence dimension. And that affective grid is a 500 by 500 pixelated grid. So it's very granular. And anywhere you click in the grid would be indicated by XY coordinate in that 500 pixelated dimension. So you get certain coordinates if you click wherever you are. So you're playing an economic game, let's say the ultimatum game. So the ultimatum game is a game that assesses how you value punishment. So if you and I are playing this game and I'm given $10 and I can split the money however I would like with you, the rules of the game are this. If I split the money and you reject whatever offer I give you, neither one of us gets the money. If you accept it, both of us get the money. So I have to figure out on my end what amount, the minimum amount that you're willing to accept, because otherwise, you know, it's a hazard of me not getting any money. Of course, I'm getting money either if you reject it. So as the responder, as the person who can decide whether to reject or accept the offer, what we look at is how an unfair offer, let's say for me, if I give you $1, how that makes you feel compared to what you expect to feel when you get that offer. So using this affective grid, this highly pixelated affective grid, we first ask you how you're going to feel if you get whatever offer you think you're going to get. I make the offer to you. It's an unfair offer. I give you 1 cent. We ask you to now remake or make again your affective feeling on this grid. And what we can do is we can take the coordinates from how you expect it to feel versus how you actually feel once you get the offer, and we can simply subtract them from one another, and we can get this numeric number in this XY grid along the valence and arousal dimensions that indicates how you feel. So this is like a sense of an emotional prediction error. We can compare it to a reward prediction error, how much you thought you're going to get from the offer and how much I actually ended up giving you. And so we can pit these reward prediction errors against these emotion prediction errors to see what ultimately is a better predictor of decisions to punish or to defect or to cooperate or whatever it might be. And we see that in this case, emotion prediction errors are far more potent in their ability to predict decisions to punish as well as other types of decisions than reward prediction errors.
Are people actually good at predicting that or quantifying what they're feeling?
Well, that's an empirical question because there's no way to, let's say, disprove what people are reporting. So the
Mhm.
report of an emotion is a subjective experience. So that might diverge from a physiological experience. So if you were to gather skin conductance response as an arousal measure, there might not be a one-to-one mapping with how introspective a person is about the physiological arousal they might have. We have yet to do that study, although I think it is an interesting study. But there's no way to prove or disprove the question that you just asked.
Uh-huh. So we're getting into like philosophical questions there, but it seems like the more overlap there is, whether that's in terms of studies being replicated or like findings that are stable cross-culturally, you kind of get at something more real. And well, it seems like we have that with emotion, right? Because there's like primary emotions that most people experience. But then I know Jonathan Haidt has also tried to do that with morality, with his moral foundations theory. What do you think of that? Is that what you use, or do you define it differently?
When you say it, do you mean
Moral foundations theory, when you're defining moral values in your research, has that become like the gold standard, or?
no? No. So we don't use moral foundations for a few reasons. One, I don't think there's we have other ways of looking at, moral decision making, and the moral foundation theory literature, it's not about moral decision making per se. It's just about quantifying what people care about in the moral domain.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I think about moral foundations is it's kind of like, how do you want to cut the cake? You can keep cutting it into constituent parts until each piece becomes like thinner and thinner and thinner, and then you have this like really, really well described moral landscape. But when you cut it so thinly, then how do each one of those constituent parts generalize, let's say, to other cultures or to other types of moral phenomena and so forth? And so as I see it, that's not such a useful practice, right? Like, what's better is to try to, take some defining features that goes across every sort of moral question or moral dilemma that we might find ourselves, pick what those 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions might be, and that would also translate across cultures, and to use those tensions and manipulate those tensions within a moral sphere. So my particular thoughts on this is that harm aversion and fairness are like 2 pillars of what go into almost every type of moral decision.
Mm-hmm.
If they had to be distilled down to something a little bit smaller than what comes out of moral foundations.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds similar again to sort of the economics view of like harm and reward. So how is it different? Like, what's the unique moral flair that's added to it?
I would say that neuroeconomics is very useful for studying morality. I think it's a great tool, because I think a lot of the issues that one studies in the field of neuroeconomics are exactly about the moral tensions that we find ourselves in when we're thinking about how to make an equal distribution about something, or who to donate to, or how many people to donate to, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like their moral decisions are easier when it's like the obvious best decision for everyone. But then there's sort of moral decisions that require sacrifice. So have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, so in some of the work that came out of my PhD, we set up this task, this is a while ago now, but we set up this task which we call the pain versus gain paradigm. And in this task, we were looking at basically self-sacrifice, in this case, monetary sacrifice against harm to another. So the task was as follows. You came into the lab and you were picked to be the decider, which was rigged, of course. And then there was another person who was going to be the receiver. And that person was going to get a series of shocks. And as the decider, you're given a sum of money. We did this in the UK. So we gave them 20 pounds and we said, okay, this money is yours to keep now, but you can spend some of this money or all of this money to preserve the welfare of this other person called the receiver, who is sitting in the room right in front of them at the time. And we take the two people, the receiver's actually a Confederate, one of my colleagues, Davey, who is such a sport, going through this rigmarole time and time again, getting so many electric shocks. We take them down to the testing labs, we put them in separate rooms, and where the Confederate, the receiver is, there's like a camera and you can see everything that's happening in that room. So like as the electric shocks get administered, as the decider of who's the true participant, they can see everything that's happening when they decide to, let's say, keep the money and a shock is administered, they can see that unfolding. And so what they have to do, they decide over 20 trials is whether to keep a pound or a portion of a pound. And if they do, that means that an electric shock or a very high electric shock will be administered to Davey. And if they decided to give up the money or to give up even some of the money, they could attenuate the electric shock or eliminate it altogether if they give up the full pound. And so they had to do this 20 times. And they're told at the end of the experiment that whatever money they have left over of that 20 will get multiplied up to 10 times. So, you know, if you're a university student, the promise or the possibility rather of 200 pounds, which is about, I don't know, $300 to $400, depending on when it is, can be quite enticing. And so people, you know, most people, every person that we tested, about 180 people, every person but one kept a portion of the money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. So one person was willing to give up the whole sum of it?
That's right.
Uh-huh. And is it like a trick where you actually reward the person who gave it up after, or do they really walk out with nothing?
They walk out with nothing.
Uh-huh. And the shocks are fake, right? So your colleague is pretending to be shocked?
The shocks are real.
Wow. That's a sacrifice of its own.
I should say this. The shocks are real, but they're not in real time. So in order to standardize Davey's emotional reactions to getting the shocks, which, you know, after he received hundreds of shocks, he habituated to them. So we had to like amplify them quite a bit over time. But as we were giving him the shock, we recorded every single shock that we gave him. And then we had those videos of him getting the shocks tested on a separate group of participants so that we could classify high shocks all into one group and medium shocks and low shocks and so on and so forth. So yeah, they were real, but they were not in real time.
That's interesting, because I wonder how many people chose to keep the money because they thought it was fake. Like I probably would have thought, oh no, they're not actually going to get shocked. They're just testing my psychology. But yeah.
I mean, that's something we were very aware of. And so we did we had this whole, song and dance of essentially deceiving the participants. So they met Davey in real time, people were signing paperwork. They could see the shocks unfolding on the camera in front of them. They also got a low level shock so they can experience it themselves. They could feel that it was, the shock was indeed real. And then of course, at the end of it, we debrief our subjects and we ask them in these coy ways to figure out whether they had any disbelief about whether the shocks were real. And we had some situations where people became quite angry with us when they found out that they were not real because they were like, I could have made so much more money. Why didn't you tell me? And so on and so forth. So.
Yeah. Was this all behavioral work, or were you also looking at their brains?
We did both. We looked at what was happening in the brain as people made these decisions, and we started just doing it behaviorally. So to make sure that the paradigm worked, because we weren't even sure if initially, one reason that we endowed our subjects with 20 pounds at the start was because we didn't actually think that people were going to prioritize the money over the welfare. So we were worried about this tension that they're going to come in, they're going to give up the money. And so we were like, okay, one way to get people to keep the money even more is to actually give them the money, make it super tangible, put it on the desk in front of them, and then they won't want to give it up because we were quite worried that we wouldn't get anybody to do that.
That makes sense. So were the brain findings, was that novel? Is there like a specific area that has to do with not just, let's say, reward and punishment, but in the social sense?
Yeah, so not just in this paradigm, but in some of the other work that we've done since we juxtapose the social versus the non-social. In this particular case, we had an imaginary condition so that we could look at what people would do hypothetically versus what they would do in reality. And you do find differences at the neural level between like a decision made for real versus one that you think that you're making that does not actually have consequences. Which, Josh Green in 2001 had this, elegant set of studies where he used the trolley dilemma. I don't know if you're aware.
Yeah.
Okay. Of the trolley dilemma, but he basically brought philosophy right into the scanner, and he asked people these incredible set of questions, like from a philosophical perspective of what would you do when you're confronted with, saving 5 lives versus killing one other person. And part of the work, which was very inspired by Josh's work, was to show that there is not necessarily a one-to-one mapping with what we think we're going to do and the decisions we think we'll make compared to what happens when we actually face those decisions.
Mm-hmm. That's a good place to bring up this idea of like whether moral values are absolute or not. So some people, for example, might say killing someone is completely wrong all the time, no matter what. And then other people, if they're presented with a trolley problem, which is like, would you kill one person to save a million others for a million? Most people probably would say yes.
Yeah, so I don't believe that moral values are absolute. I think there's really good evidence that they're contextualized, and that depending on the environment that one finds themselves in, they can be changed quite quickly. Some other work that from our lab, one of my students, Jay Young Sun, showed that basically being in the presence of a group can change your willingness to punish. So you might not be someone who really wants to punish at all, but if you see other people punishing, then you come to desire that behavior itself. You will come to want to punish as well. And so, I mean, there's, conformity is a very powerful thing, and there's a lot of evidence or a lot of research in other domains. Like, for example, if, a group of people says, oh, that person's really attractive, you yourself be like, oh, yes, they are attractive, and change your own ratings of how attractive that person is. The stakes are low in those types of situations, right? It's not staked on moral grounds. It's not something that is held to be dear, which are, what our moral beliefs are. Supposed to be privileged in that sense, but we don't find basically very little evidence that moral values are stable.
Mm-hmm. And then, so for a small minority of people, they might be, I guess Immanuel Kant might be the extreme example. So do you know of any research looking at people with, I guess, stronger, more fixed values? Like, is there anything different about their brains or the way they're processing these questions?
The work comes readily to mind is in the political sphere. And so when you put people who believe, one set of moral values in front of another person who believes a different set of moral values, those people usually become more entrenched in their political values that usually have moral tethering. I think there's the context of that is that, when you're confronted with someone who doesn't share your political beliefs, you want to hold on more strongly to what you believe is right or is wrong. And so becomes this tension with that. And so, it's a little bit, I mean, it's in that sense, it's complicated because if you didn't frame it in political terms, would people come to become entrenched in that same way or hold those beliefs even more firmly? And the answer is, I'm not sure.
Are you talking about Jonas Kaplan from USC?
Possibly. I don't remember the authors off the top of my head.
He was my very first guest on this podcast, and we talked about some of his work, looking at that type of thing. So how people respond differently to either political or religious questions as opposed to like standard questions. And it seems like they're more invested in that. It's either it has to do with morality, or maybe it's like more of an emotional response that makes them respond more strongly to those topics.
Yeah.
Right. So why is that? Why are there certain topics that people that respond a lot more strongly to?
Um,
And I'm speaking from like a scientific standpoint, if you know, I'm not saying like, why do you think someone prefers X over Y?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to emotion. I think. I mean, emotion. Again, this is like the answer is that the emotional signaling is, an important part of this process. But if someone holds a belief very firmly, as you just mentioned, in part it has to do with the emotional salience of what that belief conjures up for them. And so any deviation, or people who don't believe in that, can create an emotional signal. So there's this whole idea of affective polarization. And that's one of the reasons people think that is supposed to drive why people have these polarized beliefs that end up on two sides of the spectrum, is in part because of the power of the emotional expression that gets linked with those beliefs when they get, when people directly contradict them.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the question behind that of like, why do certain things invoke stronger emotions than others? Or maybe that's the same question.
Why do certain things evoke stronger emotions? Oof. I mean, that's a tough question that maybe is coming full circle to, what are the moral foundations? What are the things that we end up caring about? And in some ways, I don't mean to be dodging the question, but the truth is, I'm not entirely sure. And I also think it's a chicken and egg story. What comes first?
Yeah. Okay, so we should flip the switch and talk about like the most well-validated findings in this realm that you know of. And we could also talk about altruism, because that's sort of related to this social behavior and morality, but it's sort of its own thing.
Okay. So which one do you want to start with?
Let's talk about altruism, and then we could close talking about like everything that's very well established.
Sure. So what should we talk about with altruism?
Well, let's talk about how you define it in your research and how it's different from what we've been talking about so far.
So I would define altruism as a person's willingness to give up something that is beneficial to them in order to help another person. And so that was actually one of the ways that we thought about studying altruism, which falls under the hood of morality, with this pain versus gain paradigm. There's different flavors of altruism, right? So you don't necessarily have to have it be staked on, monetary or harm grounds. And in the animal kingdom, the altruism can look like a lot of different ways. But when it comes to humans interacting with other humans, altruism, has the quality of, do I care about my own benefit, whether that be my time, my happiness, or whatever, however you want to quantify it, compared to the time, the money, the happiness, the welfare of somebody else that you're interacting with. So like fidelity would also fit in the broadest sense under this idea of altruism. Of course, these are really hard things to study in the lab, right? So one of the things that's difficult about studying morality is figuring out sort of clever proxies or analogs for what happens in the real world when we see people like deviate from, let's say, normative behavior, and getting them to do it, in the lab with people watching them, knowing that they're in a psychological study. So half the battle, I think, is trying to figure out how to study this stuff. And these like really thorny issues and get people to do stuff that they wouldn't normally do with other people watching in a laboratory environment.
Right. Oh, I had a question, but I forgot it. Yeah, let's talk more about the methodology with trying to get people to do certain things without knowing that that's what you want them to do.
Yeah, we're masterminds of that. We do that a lot in the lab. So I don't know, this reaches back all the way back to some of like the oldest psychology studies, social psychology studies. The thing is, people are really savvy now. So Milgram, everybody knows about Milgram and this artist prison study. And so we have to be very careful about planning our studies, because a lot of people know about social psychology research, and even if they don't know, let's say, the specifics of certain things, the people who come into the lab are always, thinking that we're trying to, pull the wool over their eyes, which in many cases we are. But they're very attuned to that. So there's all sorts of things that we try to do And this is especially true when we're running studies online, which of course, like through the pandemic, has become paramount because we weren't able, certainly not in the beginning, to run studies in the lab. So you have to get people on the internet to think that they're engaging with other people on the internet in real time, thinking that they're doing what they're doing. In some cases, we do studies like that. So we have people wait until enough people enter the room, and then there's 10 people, and they can all collectively play with one another. Putting those paradigms together is really hard. It takes a lot of technological savviness. So what we do is, we have these tricks of the trade where we can, get your internet ID, your mTurker ID, your prolific ID, and have them put it into a system, and it gets, put onto the screen, and they can pick their avatar, and then they're told that there's this other mTurker. There's all these tricks that we do to get people to think that they're, I don't want to let them all out of the bag here, but to make them believe that they're playing with other people in real time on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good to know. So the question that I forgot had to do with altruism, and it's sort of more of a philosophical question, but it's does true altruism really exist? Because you can define it as making a sacrifice for some greater good or for someone else's benefit, but then you could also make an argument that maybe what they're doing is in fact going to selfishly aid them in the long term. So it's more whether it's a calculated process versus this genuine altruistic process.
Yeah, so you're certainly not the first person to have asked me this. And I guess my response to this is, in some ways, is it actually an interesting question of whether there's genuine altruism or not? Does it matter if there's this pure altruistic sense that we hold in all of us, or whether it's tainted by the fact that, let's say, we feel good by helping somebody else? And yeah, you're right. Maybe in philosophical terms, there is something interesting about that. And maybe you could argue that would lead to, let's say, two different types of behaviors. But when it comes down to studying real people in real time and real interacting minds, I don't know how much mileage there is in saying, okay, well, this person made a decision out of this pure altruistic, choice versus this person did it because they wanted to be lauded by their community. If there were very divergent behavioral profiles associated with each, then I think it would become a really interesting psychological question. But I also think it's really hard to figure out whether a decision is made from a purely altruistic sense. I wouldn't really know how to do that, and to basically control out everything other than that hedonically good feeling that you might get from helping somebody else.
Right, because these are all subjective issues. But then I guess the hallmark of social psychology is that when you have enough subjective things, when there's overlap, then it starts to be just true humans generally, or at least that's the hope, right?
Yeah, so I mean, if that's what we're trying to understand, whether people do have, whether there's a portion of people who do, let's say, have a pure altruistic sense, or being in ways that are purely altruistic, I don't think there's good evidence for that, right? I think that people, there's always a self quote unquote selfish component to the types of decisions we make, even if it's just, I'm doing it because I feel good, I'm being empathic, I'm being kind, I'm helping another person because I feel good about doing that. I think that is a big component of altruism. So I'm not sure that pure altruism at the human level exists, although I'm happy to be proved wrong.
Yeah, I guess if you want to take an evolutionary perspective to it, you could say, why do we even feel good about that? And the answer might be something like, well, if this was the altruistic solution that helped us survive, maybe over long spans of time, we started feeling good about the good options.
Yeah.
So this would be a good place to talk about basically everything that, we don't have time for that, but some of the major findings that you've made that are well validated and that you're currently expanding on. So what they are, and then what you're currently working on to expand upon them.
Oh gosh. Okay, well validated. So
just the most interesting, but I say well validated just because it's to try and get a sense of where this field is going.
One of the findings that is the most, let's say, well validated that has come out of the lab, other than the fact that people are selfish and behave in selfish ways, is the idea that people are not routinely seeking out punishment when they're faced with someone who's behaved poorly. So, in a series of studies, I think we probably tested, thousands of people at this point, maybe even around 5,000 people, both in the lab and online. What we find is that if you are the victim of a moral violation, so let's say someone treats you unfairly, you as the victim don't desire to punish the person who treated you poorly. The desire to punish comes much more strongly when you're a third party witnessing somebody behave, let's say, unfairly to another person. If you, as that third party, are able to make a decision about whether that person should be, the perpetrator should be given a punishment, then you desire punishment. So there's this disconnect between basically being a victim of a crime and wanting to punish, and being, let's say, a third party arbitrator and wanting to punish the person, the perpetrator.
That's very interesting. So what does the victim think then? You ask follow-up questions of like, okay, if you don't want to punish them, what are you feeling?
Yeah. So we have. So for the most part, what it seems like is that people are taking the moral high ground as the victim. They might be doing that for different reasons. One, they might be wanting to teach, for example. That's what some people say. And so they want to teach, for example. Another says that they, another group of people will say that they basically want to curtail the negative social choices that are being made. So someone acted poorly. I don't want to keep that as, this vengeful cycle going on and on. And so I'm going to basically stop it in its tracks. I guess a third group of people would say that they basically have the power to, turn the other cheek. That it's not important. It's not so important to, be retributive. And then the people who are the third party, individuals who are making these decisions to punish are the ones who say, it's not up to me to forgive. Like, in fact, not only is it not up to me to forgive, but it's my moral obligation, because the law of the land in, let's say, this country, but also in many Western countries, is that someone who does something that's wrong, who does a moral violation, should be punished. And so because I'm not the victim, it's not up to me to disregard that social normative behavior. And in fact, people who are third parties and who disregard that, meaning that they don't punish, are seen as morally inferior to those who are third parties who do punish.
Mm-hmm. How much of this desire for punishment is like, I have a responsibility to punish, as opposed to more just this abstract desire for, let's say, the government or for karma to make things right?
Well, I would argue that if it was karma or something like that to make things right, then even the victim should be wanting to punish, right? Because that should, be the principle that even a victim would be working under. I think what it sort of calls attention to is that there's a disconnect between what the government does and what the person who is the victim of the crime actually wants, and whether there should be more crosstalk between victims of crimes and those who are deciding the level of punishment on the perpetrator. Because if we care about what the victim wants, then there should be more communication about what happens in the wake of crime.
Mm-hmm. So this was a surprise, right? Did you expect the victims to be the ones with the strong?
No, I mean, we definitely thought there were going to be differences between a victim and a third party, but we actually thought it was going to be the reverse of that. And so, going into setting up the paradigm and asking the question, the reason we have these, the victim versus the third party, is because we thought that the victims would be like these super punitive people, and that the third parties would be the ones to turn the cheek. And it was the exact opposite we had. And in all honesty, the number at which the 67% of victims who don't punish is in every single paradigm that we've run, every single, whether it's online or in the lab, with we've run it even in a really big economics lab with 30 people at once playing with each other. So you can see the other people. They don't know who they're being paired up with, but they can see that all their choices are happening in real time. And it doesn't matter what the context is. you still get about 67% of victims saying like, I will not punish the perpetrator. So it's like an incredibly consistent number that we get. So that's perhaps our most well-validated finding.
Mm-hmm. Are there like personality differences between the types of people that want to punish and not?
Probably.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that there are. I don't know what they are though. We haven't done a deep dive on individual differences, but,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
there are.
Yeah, so maybe that's one of the future next steps. What about you personally? What projects have you got planned for the next few years?
Sure. So I guess one of the things that we're looking at very actively right now is the idea that cognitive maps, in the Tolman sense, act as a representational format for how we encode social networks. So this is work led by one of my graduate students, Jay, and what he's doing right now is he has all of these, artificial, although we're also actually about to do it in real social networks. I'll just tell you about the artificial networks. We basically create these artificial networks. So let's say we have a group of 20 people, and all of those people are connected with other people within that group. And so you get this graphic representation between all the relationships of the people. And the idea is whether a cognitive map, so should I say what a cognitive map is for this audience?
Sure.
Okay, so a cognitive map is basically a representation of how things are related to one another. So, this, comes back all the way to when Tolman was studying how rats run through a maze and found out that even in these unrewarded experiences, if a rat runs through a maze and experiences all the little T's and the X's and the arms of the maze, through enough exploration, they will represent what that map is even in ways where, let's say, there's a wall is put up in the maze, so they can't get through that particular arm. The rat will very quickly figure out that they can take another route because they have a representation called a cognitive map that shows all the relationships in space. And so this idea of cognitive maps really well onto space. But only in the last couple of years have people started to take this idea of a cognitive map and introduce it to other more abstract phenomena. In particular, the last year or two, we've seen some work come out that showed that cognitive maps also extend to social phenomenon. So in this work that we're looking at, this paper is actually about to come out. What we found is that people do use cognitive maps to represent social networks, and they do it in a kind of interesting space. So one way to represent how people are connected with one another is not necessarily on the relationship between, let's say, Tom and Sally. Tom and Sally have a relationship, and Sally and Brian have a relationship. But to use features of Tom, of Sally, of Brian, let's say that they are both in the chess club, or they're both physicists, or whatever, and they can use those features to create what are called, let's say, cognitive maps of social features, and that allows people to make inferences about parts of the network that they have no knowledge of. So if you, let's say in any social network, let's say you have your high school friends, your college friends, your work friends, whatever it might be, you have good knowledge about some of that network, who's connected to who and how deep that relationship is, but you certainly don't have access to all of the network, right? There's going to be holes or gaps in your knowledge. And so you can use these cognitive maps of social features to fill in those gaps, to figure out how people in the network that you don't know who necessarily might be connected, you can make inferences about them if you use these features like knowing who likes chess, or who goes on long bike rides, or whatever it might be.
So is the map like the way you're imagining these social rankings, like Tom is better than Sally at chess and Sally's more popular than Tom at school, and like all these different little things? And is that the type of map?
Yeah, so the way that we've tested it is not necessarily in a hierarchical way, in the sense that people are ranked within the social network, but rather, individuals that share some common property, whether it be like cycling enthusiasts or chemists or what have you. We have that as a social the social feature that defines how the map is built. The map is built on that social feature, like a chess map, or a biking map, or so on and so forth.
So then the last part you mentioned, with like filling in the blanks, is that something like maybe you know someone likes basketball and football and baseball, but you don't know if they like lacrosse, but you say they probably do because they're a sporty person, and then you say they probably don't like chess because, well, they're a sporty person. Is it like that?
Well, the way that we tested it in these set of experiments is we would say, okay, there's a transfer student coming into this network, and you know that this transfer network, Natalia, it likes chess. Who is she going to be friends with? And you can make really good inferences based on that one piece of knowledge that she likes chess, of who she's going to be friends with based on your cognitive map, your chess cognitive map.
That makes sense. So is this a completely new area, or is it like we have well-validated findings of whatever the social cognitive processes are, but we don't know how it works in the brain, and that's what you're bringing to the table?
I would say that the idea that cognitive maps are a representational format for social networks has yet to be shown, and that this is the first work that shows that, and it gives a mechanistic account of how we build those social cognitive maps.
That's very cool. Okay, so what would be the major implication of that? Well, it sounds like you're already showing that that's the case, but what would it do to change the field?
For us, it's an exciting place because we have a whole bunch of studies that we have planned to dig deep in this domain, including bringing it to real social networks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with studying this type of thing with real social networks is that learning happens outside the lab. So you cannot quantify learning in an artificial network by, giving people like a whole set of individuals who are connected to one another and having them like learn from scratch a social network. One way that we're doing this is we're going to follow a cohort of incoming freshmen at Brown University who have yet to establish a social network. So that's going to be like our ground zero, right? They have no connections.
Mm-hmm.
They're coming to Brown, they're about to build their social network, and we're going to follow them over time as they build their social network and as the social network critically changes, and to see whether cognitive maps basically allow for affordances of how you navigate through your network. For example, understanding how gossip transmits to the network, even when the network changes. Let's say when there's a relationship that's been broken because the friendship's ended, or a new relationship that's been created, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Oriel, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure having me.